Some truths are too deep for a lecture. They can only be carried in a story. For thousands of years, the wisest teachers did not explain the way to peace. They told a tale and let the tale do its quiet work, sinking into the heart long after the words were forgotten. Tonight, I will tell you 7 ancient Buddhist stories. They are simple stories, the kind a grandmother might tell by the fire. But hidden inside each one is a key that can unlock a more peaceful way of living the second half of your hour. Life, do not rush through them. Let each story settle into you, the way a stone settles slowly to the bottom of a still pond. And watch, as you listen, how each one quietly rearranges something inside you. The final story, in particular, holds a truth that many people search for their entire lives and never find. Stay with me to the end. Now, make yourself comfortable, breathe slowly, and let us begin, as all good stories begin, once upon a time. The first story is called The Empty Boat. Long ago, a man was rowing his small boat across a wide, misty river at dawn. He was a man quick to anger and proud of it. As he rowed through the fog, he saw another boat coming straight toward him, drifting closer and closer until it struck his own boat with a hard thud. The man was furious. He stood up, red in the face, and shouted into the fog, "You fool! Watch where you are going. How dare you strike my boat?" He prepared to unleash all his anger upon the careless rower. But as the fog thinned, he saw something that stopped him cold. The other boat was empty. It was an old, untied boat, drifting alone on the current, with no one aboard at all. And in an instant, all his anger vanished. There was no one to shout at, no one to blame. The boat was simply empty, carried by the river, and it had bumped his boat by pure chance. His rage, a moment ago so hot and certain, had nowhere to land. It simply dissolved into the morning mist. Now hear the wisdom in this, especially for the later years. So much of our anger, our hurt, our sleepless nights of resentment comes from believing that someone did something to us on purpose. The relative who forgot to call, the stranger who was rude, the friend who let us down. We fill their empty boat with intention, with insult, with meaning, and then we rage against it. But the Buddha taught that most people are simply empty boats, drifting on the current of their own troubles, their own exhaustion, their own blindness. The person who was short with you was not plodding your pain. They were drifting, carried by a hard day, a private sorrow, a life you cannot see. They bumped into you by chance and rode on and have already forgotten. Here is the practice this story gives us. The next time someone bumps against you with a careless word or a thoughtless act, before you fill your heart with anger, pause and say gently to yourself, "It is only an empty boat. They were not aiming at me. They were simply drifting." And watch your anger, like the man's in the fog. Find that it has nowhere to land. After 60, life is far too short and far too precious to spend it shouting at empty boats. The second story is called The 2 Arrows. One day, the Buddha asked his students a question. When a person is struck by an arrow, he said, "Does it hurt?" "Yes," the students answered, "of course it hurts." "And if that same person is struck by a second arrow in the very same spot," he asked, "does it hurt even more?" "Yes," they said, "much more." Then the Buddha taught them a truth that has echoed for 25 centuries. In life, he said, we cannot always avoid the first arrow. The first arrow is the pain that life itself sends, the aching joints of age, the loss of a friend, the disappointment, the illness, the simple hardships that come to every living being. That first arrow we often cannot stop, but the second arrow, he said, the second arrow we shoot into ourselves. The second arrow is our reaction to the pain. It is the worry, the resentment, the endless replaying, the why me, the bitterness, the fear of what comes next. The first arrow is the pain. The second arrow is the suffering we add to it. And here is the astonishing thing the Buddha revealed. Nearly all of our misery comes not from the first arrow, but from the second, the one we fire into our own hearts again and again. Consider this in your own later years. The aches of an aging body are the first arrow, and they are real. But the fear, the despair, the lying awake dreading tomorrow, the anger at a body that is simply growing older, all of that is the second arrow. And the second arrow is optional. An old monk and an old complainer may suffer the very same aching knees, but one accepts the ache, tends it gently, and lives in peace, while the other adds a mountain of anguish on top of it and lives in misery. The pain was equal, the suffering was a choice. Here is the practice. When the next hardship comes, and it will, fill the first arrow honestly. It is real, and you need not pretend it away. But then, catch your own hand before it fires the second arrow. Notice the worry, the resentment, the story of despair, beginning to rise, and gently set the bow down. Say to yourself, this is the first arrow, and I will not add a second. You will be amazed how much of your suffering was never the pain itself, but only the second arrow, the one you have the power to lay down. The third story is called The Farmer and the Horse. In a small village lived an old farmer who had worked his fields for many years. One day, his only horse ran away into the hills. His neighbors came to console him. What terrible luck, they said. Now how will you plow your fields? The old farmer only shrugged and said, maybe. A week later, the horse returned, and it brought with it 3 wild horses from the hills. How wonderful, the neighbors cried. Now you are rich with horses. The farmer only shrugged and said, maybe. The next day, his son tried to ride one of the wild horses, was thrown to the ground, and broke his leg badly. What awful misfortune, the neighbors said. Your only son, unable to work. The farmer shrugged and said, maybe. A week later, soldiers came to the village, taking every able young man away to fight in a distant and bloody war. But seeing the son's broken leg, they passed him by and left him home. What great fortune, the neighbors marveled, and the old farmer only smiled and said, maybe. Now hear the deep wisdom of this old tale. We spend our lives rushing to judge each event as a disaster or a blessing. This is the worst thing that ever happened. This is wonderful. But the farmer knew a secret that comes only with age and long watching. We can never see the whole story. The misfortune of today becomes the blessing of tomorrow. The blessing of today plants the seed of tomorrow's sorrow. Life is a long and winding river, and from where we stand, we can see only a single bend. The Buddha taught this same truth, that clinging to our judgments of good and bad is a source of great suffering, because we simply do not know how the story ends. Think of your own long life. How many times has a closed door, a loss, a disappointment. That felt like the end of the world, turned out to be the very thing that led you somewhere better. Here is the practice this story offers, and it is a gift of great peace. When something happens that seems like a disaster, instead of collapsing into despair, try the farmer's wisdom. Say simply, maybe this is bad. Maybe, in time, it will prove to be good. I cannot yet see the whole river. This one small word, maybe, holds open a door that despair would slam shut. It keeps you humble before a life too vast to fully understand, and it lets you meet the turns of your later years, not with panic, but with a calm and patient trust. The fourth story is called The Cracked Pot. A water bearer in an old village had two large pots, which he carried on a pole across his shoulders to fetch water from the stream each day. One pot was perfect and always delivered a full portion of water, but the other pot had a crack, and by the time the bearer walked home, it was only ever half full. For 2 years this went on, the perfect pot proud of its work, and the cracked pot ashamed of its flaw, miserable that it could only ever do half of what it was meant to do. One day, by the stream, the cracked pot spoke to the water bearer in its bitterness. I am ashamed of myself, it said. This crack in my side lest the water leak out all the way home. You do all this work, and because of my flaw, you never get full value. The water bearer smiled gently and said, as we walk back today, I want you to notice the beautiful flowers along the path. And as they climbed the hill, the cracked pot saw wildflowers blooming all along its side of the path, warm in the sun, and its heart lifted a little. But at the end of the walk, it was still sad, for again it had leaked half its water. Then the water bearer said something the cracked pot never forgot. Did you notice that the flowers grow only on your side of the path, and not on the other? Pot sighed. That is because I have always known about your crack. So I planted flower seeds on your side, and every day as we walk home, you water them. For 2 years, I have been able to pick these beautiful flowers to grace the table. Without you being just the way you are, this beauty would not exist. Now hear this story with your whole heart, especially if you feel, in your later years, that you are not what you once were. You may feel cracked, slower than you were, weaker, more forgetful, unable to do all that you once did. And a quiet shame may whisper that you are now less valuable, a leaking pot, a burden. But the Buddha taught that nothing is without its purpose, and that our very imperfections are woven into the beauty of the whole. Your cracks, the softness age has brought, the slowing down, are not only losses. They are the very things that let you notice the flowers now, that make you gentler, more patient, more compassionate, more able to water beauty into the world, in ways your younger, perfect, hurrying self never could. Here is the practice. When you grieve what age has taken, when you feel like the cracked pot, pause and ask, what beauty has grown along my path because of my cracks, and not in spite of them? The patience you have now, the wisdom, the tenderness, the time to truly see, you are not a broken vessel, leaking away your worth. You are watering flowers that the perfect pot could never grow. The fifth story is called The Handful of Salt. An old teacher had a student who complained constantly, forever bitter about the hardships of his life. One morning, the teacher asked the young man to bring him a handful of salt. When he returned, The teacher told him to stir the salt into a glass of water and drink it. The student did and spat it out at once. "How does it taste?" the teacher asked. "Bitter," said the student, "terribly bitter." The teacher nodded and then led the young man down to a wide, clear lake. "Now take another handful of salt," he said, "and throw it into the lake." The student scattered the salt across the water. "Now," said the teacher, "drink from the lake." The student cupped the cool water in his hands and drank. "And how does it taste now?" asked the teacher. "Fresh," said the student, "clean and sweet." "Can you taste the salt?" the teacher asked. "No," said the young man, and the old teacher sat down beside him on the shore and said this: "The pain of life is like the salt. The amount of salt is always the same, no more, no less. But the bitterness we taste depends entirely on the vessel we place the pain into. So when you are in pain, the only thing you can do is to widen your senses, to enlarge the container. Stop being a small glass. Become a great lake. Now hear this, for it speaks straight to the heart of the later years. The hardships of age are real, and they are the same for everyone. The losses, the aches, the changes. That is the salt, and we cannot reduce it. But whether it makes our whole life taste bitter, or whether we can barely taste it at all, depends on the size of the heart we hold it in. A small, narrow heart, closed and clenched, tastes every grain of life's salt as bitterness. But a great, wide heart, opened by wisdom and gratitude and compassion, can hold the very same pain and still taste the sweetness of life all around it. Here is the practice. When bitterness rises, do not try to remove the salt, for you cannot. Instead, work to widen the lake. Count your blessings until the container grows larger. Step outside and feel how vast the world is. Offer kindness to another and feel your own heart expand. The pain remains, but in a wider heart, it can no longer poison the whole of the water. Become the lake, my friend, and life grows sweet again. The sixth story is called The Cup of Tea. A learned professor, proud of all he knew, once traveled far to visit a famous old Zen master, hoping to learn the secrets of wisdom. But from the moment he arrived, the professor did not stop talking. He spoke of his degrees, his theories, his many accomplishments, barely pausing for breath, certain he already understood almost everything. The old master listened patiently, and then offered to serve tea. He placed a cup before the professor and began to pour. The tea rose to the brim of the cup, and then, to the professor's astonishment, the master kept pouring. The tea overflowed, spilling across the table, running onto the floor. "Stop!" the professor cried. "The cup is full. No more will go in." The old master set down the pot and smiled and said quietly, "You are like this cup. You are already so full of your own opinions, your own certainties, your own knowledge, that there is no room for anything new. How can I show you wisdom until you first empty your cup? Now hear the gift in this small story, for it holds a secret of staying young in spirit, even as the body grows old. There is a great temptation, after 60, to believe that we have already learned all that life can teach us. We have seen so much. We know how the world works. We have made up our minds. And so, without noticing, our cup grows full and stops receiving. But the Buddha taught that the beginner's mind, the open, curious, humble mind, is the mind that stays alive. The elders who remain the most vibrant, the most joyful, the most beloved, are not those who know the most. They are those who have kept their cup a little empty, still curious, still willing to learn, to change their minds, to be surprised by life. Here is the practice. This week, empty your cup, just a little. Let go of one thing you are absolutely certain of. Ask a genuine question, and truly listen to the answer without waiting to give your own. Try something new, something small that your certain, full self would have refused. A full cup can receive nothing, not even joy, but an empty cup is open to the whole of life, right up until the very last day. Stay curious, my friend. Keep your cup open, and life will keep pouring. The seventh story is called The Two Monks and the River. Two monks, one old and one young, were traveling together on a long journey. They came to the bank of a wide river, where the current ran fast and deep. There, at the edge of the water, stood a young woman in fine silk robes, unable to cross, afraid of the rushing current. Now, these monks had taken a solemn vow never to touch a woman. The young monk looked away and prepared to wade across alone, leaving her behind. But the old monk, without a word, simply lifted the woman gently onto his back, carried her across. The river through the fast water, set her down safely on the far bank, and continued on his way. The young monk was scandalized, but he said nothing. They walked on in silence for an hour, then 2 hours, then 3. The young monk grew more and more agitated, until at last, unable to bear it any longer, he burst out, "How could you do that? We took a vow never to touch a woman, and you carried her in your very arms across the entire river." The old monk walked on peacefully for a moment, and then he smiled and said, "My brother, I set that woman down on the riverbank 3 hours ago. Why are you still carrying her?" And there the young monk stood, struck silent, for he understood. His teacher had let the woman go at the water's edge, but he himself had been carrying her, in his mind, in his judgment, in his resentment, for 3 long hours, and she was heavy indeed. Now here is the deepest teaching of the night, the one so many search for and never find. We think that our burdens are the things that happen to us, the insult, the betrayal, the loss, the old argument. But the Buddha taught that the true burden is not the thing itself. It is our refusal to set it down. The event happened once, long ago, at some riverbank in the past. But we pick it up and we carry it for 3 hours, or 3 years, or 3 decades, growing more and more weary, wondering why our hearts are so heavy. And all the while, the answer is simple. We never put it down. Think of what you may still be carrying. A hurt from long ago. A grudge against someone who has forgotten they ever wronged you. A regret you have hauled through half your life. The riverbank is far behind you now, but are you still carrying her? Here is the final practice, and it may be the most freeing thing you ever do. Choose one thing you have been carrying too long. Feel its weight in your arms, and then, consciously, gently, like the old monk, set it down on the bank where it belongs, and walk on, light and free. You crossed that river long ago. It is time, at last, to put the burden down. 7 stories, my friend, and 7 keys. The empty boat, which teaches us that no one is truly aiming at us. The 2 arrows, which reminds us that the second one is always our choice. The farmer and his horse, which whispers may be when we rush to judge. The cracked pot, which shows us the flowers that grow only because of our flaws. The handful of salt, which teaches us to widen the heart until the bitterness fades. The cup of tea, which asks us to stay open and curious to the very end. And the two monks at the river, which asks us, gently, why are you still carrying her? These are not just stories to be heard once and forgotten. They are companions for the quiet years. When anger rises, remember the empty boat. When pain comes, watch for the second arrow. When disaster seems certain, say maybe. When you feel broken, look for your flowers. When life turns bitter, widen the lake. When you feel certain and closed, empty your cup. And when your heart feels heavy, ask yourself what you are still carrying and set it down. The wisest people of the later years are not those who have escaped hardship. They are those who have learned to carry it lightly, or better still, to set it down. May these 5 old stories walk beside you now, in the quiet evenings, and lighten every step you have left to take. If one of these stories touched your heart tonight, tell me in the comments which one, and leave one word, light, so that others may know these old tales still have the power to heal. Subscribe to Wisdom Quiet, and let a gentle story find you each week. Until then, my friend, remember the old monk's smile at the river. Set down what you have carried too long, and walk on at last in peace.